Hello, hello. Megan Thompson here with Megan Thompson Coaching. And this is part 2 of a 2-part series where I am talking to you parents as a sibling of a highly sensitive child. So today we're going to dive deeper on what we discussed in the last video related to knowing exactly how to support your highly sensitive child and other children in your home if you're parenting multiple kids. And my objective today is to speak more about the lessons that I had to learn in growing up alongside a highly sensitive child when my parents were using traditional parenting strategies. So many of you know that I have a loving, close connection with my parents, and it's quite healthy and supportive. And it's also true that they know that they didn't know what they didn't know in parenting in the 80s and the 90s, and they wish they had a different plan. And so what I want to speak about today is what's near and dear to her whole family's heart, which is the mission of MTC, which is to support parents of highly sensitive kids to eliminate the daily meltdown cycle. And we help parents do that. We've helped hundreds of parents at this point across both businesses, the private practice or the coaching company, which is how you know me through these videos. And in doing so, our mission at MTC is to eliminate suicidal thoughts for highly sensitive children and people around the world. And in order to do that, I need to speak very what's the word? Really isn't a word. Very raw and real at times about what goes on in parents' minds, and what's going on in your mind and your heart, but also what's happening for your highly sensitive child and the rest of the family. So as much as I would love to say that this is just an anomaly experience that only my particular family experienced, after working with hundreds of families, both individual with working with children in the private practice over the decade plus, and then also for the last several years parent coaching, I have to say that my experience is not an anomaly. So if you're new to this, make sure that you're listening in, because it's super crucial to understand where you might be stuck and why using parenting strategies that are more traditional, like timeouts, punishments, removing privileges for bad behavior, rewards, sticker charts, encouraging accomplishments over emotional health, is all ineffective for parenting both highly sensitive kids and non-highly sensitive kids. And we'll talk about that today. So many of you might wonder, obviously I run 2 businesses and they're quite successful. So why would I feel sad about the lessons that I learned in being parented? And I have to tell you that what I've learned and why I'm so successful is in terms of helping parents and being a successful adult with a happy family, etc. I had to learn a lot of lessons in my early adulthood in order to get to the place that I am at. So I really want to acknowledge the lessons that I learned in being parented traditionally, and then cover what it took for me to move out of those unhealthy personality patterns that I had when I was younger, because it's important for parents to not justify traditional parenting when you yourself might have been traditionally parented and can hold down a job effectively and have a family where you have a loving relationship with your spouse or co-parent, etc., and not use that as justification for traditional parenting. So there are other factors in your skill sets that have helped you stick around in a healthy way, and it is not the traditional parenting that has gotten you here. So I really want to get clear on that, because we're going to talk about why traditional parenting had, created some pretty significant crutches for me in growing up, and why we see this as a significant pattern for all children, especially highly sensitive children. So the 4 lessons that I had to learn, right? Now, this is a blunt and clear conversation, and it's important to notice again that I'm doing that so that you can change the ripple effect that you're creating in your household. Not because I'm resentful of my parents. Dealt with that emotional experience of feeling frustrated and stuck years ago. And so that's why I'm able to do this on the internet now. Okay, so number one, I learned that I'm not allowed to make too much noise. Now, what does that mean? What do I want to speak about that? When parenting a highly sensitive child or a non-highly sensitive child and using traditional parenting strategies, I learned that negative emotions are not allowed. That when I was mad, sad, frustrated, my typical pattern for my personality was to yell about it or get angry. And that was my go-to emotion. And we know for sure that anger is a secondary emotion. And with that being true, it's important to understand that there was a lot of hurt and pain and frustration underneath that anger. But my parents didn't know how to help me develop skills to become emotionally regulated and to be okay feeling emotions without creating bad behaviors, ineffective behaviors, if you will. So they treated my bad behavior like inappropriate or ineffective. And so I was parented with lectures and soap in the mouth and timeouts and groundings and the occasional spanking. So as much as we know better now, let's do better. Okay, so let's talk about this. What that led me to learn is that my emotions, if they're not happy, are not appropriate. They're not okay, and I shouldn't really pay attention to them. And so what that led me to do was blame other people for my negative experiences. And so I became a brash or blunt person who called it like it is. Now, what that does is it allowed me to stay hard-nosed. It allowed me to stay, what's the word? Closed off to vulnerability. And so we see this in parenting highly sensitive kids, right? You can end up on the pressuring my way or the highway perspective. And so I was responding to other adults in my relationships like that. Not necessarily in my professional relationships because I knew that that would get me fired. However, as a teenager, I definitely responded to my boss like that. I was not an effective employee. I was in the restaurant business, so I was great with the customers and brought in a lot of revenue for the restaurant, which is probably why I kept my job. Because I was good at the customer facing stuff, but I was not an effective employee in terms of how I spoke to the management, who was in a micromanaging pattern of their own. But I just wasn't having any of that. And so I earned the nickname, earned some what's the word? I earned some reputations of being an angry person and just unhappy when I was frustrated or stuck or stressed. So for me at that age, it was everybody else's fault. It was everybody else's fault. And because my negative emotion wasn't mine, I couldn't deal with it. I wasn't allowed to have it. So it had to be somebody else's fault. So I learned that the negative emotions are not allowed. So don't make too much noise because we don't want to hear it. And I'm saying that not because my parents ever said that directly, but the message that I learned is that it wasn't allowed. Now, the next thing that I learned is that I needed to take care of other people, right? So when you're parented traditionally, parents' emotions and their negative emotions are valued higher than the child's. So if I am upset and I am yelling or stuck or frustrated and a parent gets stuck or frustrated with me, then I am doing that to them and they are upset with my behavior and it's my job to keep them happy. So what happened is I learned from traditional parenting that it is my job to take care of other people at my own expense. So, hi, I'm a therapist. Nice to meet you. I went into school to take care of other people, but I actually went into school to save people. early in my high school career, I knew that I wanted to be a therapist. And I say high school career because that's basically how I treated high school. I was already an adult and already working. I was not in an exploratory language of, just being an adolescent and exploring and learning about myself. I was performing like an adult. Type A, high GPA, begging and pleading to get into the 2-year courses a year early, because I needed to make my career choices. So I was aging quickly, which is a sign of, in the clinical world, we call this parentification, where you need to be in charge of yourself and even in charge of your siblings because your parents are strapped in other ways. So we see this in families where there's a lot of trauma and the oldest child is expected to take care of the younger children. And then we also see this in, which can be traumatic, the daily meltdown cycle for highly sensitive children, where parents are strapped parenting a sensitive kid, especially with traditional parenting strategies. So it was my job to take care. And I needed to take care of myself, and I needed to, I developed that desire in high school. And the objective I had was to feel capable based on my performance. I'm going to speak about this in the last piece from a different angle, but right now, in terms of having my career already decided in high school, and knowing exactly what I was going to do and how I was going to get there, was viewed as a significant strength. And I'm not going to say it wasn't. I was put on this earth to do this job. And it's also true that my priorities were only banked on that goal for quite many years. So I did not live a balanced life, and it showed because the objective to take care of other people also played out in my relationship with my sister. I became her name is Shannon, the Shannon Whisperer. My parents didn't understand how my sister's brain works, how she thinks, how she expresses, how she communicates emotionally. And so I ended up acknowledging and diagnosing her eating disorder when I was in grad school for my parents because they couldn't see it. And neither could my sister, which makes sense because she was a young adult who had developed anorexia, and that's a life-threatening issue. And the mental state that you're in is swarming with depression and anxiety when you have symptoms of anorexia. And so it's very difficult to see that there's a problem when you're focused on controlling your body weight to the point where you're not eating enough. And so there's a lot of emotional turmoil going on for her. But also my parents, they were stuck in survival mode, as I spoke about in part 1 of this training, of just helping her decrease panic week after week. So it was at that point how to get out of some challenges she was having with her boss, how to get out of some challenges she was having finishing an internship early because it was too stressful, how to get out of challenges with and this was, just stemming from consistent firefighting in adolescence for her, where she would need their consistent support, doing all of her homework with her, helping her navigate her friendships, and coming home every weekend in college to support her and making sure she did her work, because she didn't feel emotionally capable of handling the workload. And as much as there was some comprehension issues with that, a lot of it stemmed from her emotional struggles. And so that pattern continued itself into young adulthood, when she was expected to go live by herself, out of the dorms, out of the college apartment. And that was a huge struggle, to say the least, for her, because she didn't have the skills to emotionally manage herself. And so when I saw her after, returning home from, I think about the timeline, I think I was visiting from grad school, and having studied anorexia and learning about that diagnosis, and then seeing her physical symptoms that were quite obvious, hair loss, weight loss, skeletal figure. My parents were more focused at that point related to the fear and frustration she was experiencing in her job, and they weren't able to see the slow decline of her weight loss because they were focused with her on her struggle. What she had named was the biggest challenge at the moment. And so the caretaking became even bigger for me at that point. I learned that I needed to take care of my parents and my sister, and help from that place of, okay, here's what you're supposed to do. Let's find the therapist. Let's do all this. Now, many of you who follow Megan Thompson Coaching and what we teach, you follow us here, are in the medical or helping field. And so, of course, your expertise might have been tapped into as parents. From relatives just asking you, if you're a nurse, hey, can you look at this cut on FaceTime? Is it, should I go to the hospital? And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, legitimately making sure that everybody is okay emotionally for 6 months plus, while getting while helping my sister engage in treatment. And that's a lot of pressure for a young adult to experience. And so at that point, I significantly neglected my other relationships. I was, I think about the timeline, I had graduated, or was right at the time of graduating. No, it was a year after graduation of grad school, and dating my husband at the time, who was my boyfriend, and just significantly fried to the point where I couldn't be emotionally available for him, and fell back into a pattern of being an angry person, because that's what I learned in adolescence. So somehow he decided that I was still marriage material. With that being said, it was rough. It was a really rough experience, and I needed to work on learning how to manage my emotions, and then do that at a time of big stresses. And that's a skill that I had to learn in early adulthood. Unfortunately, that experience was not the wake-up call of realizing that I struggled without, by prioritizing people other than myself. I didn't learn that till a little while later, a couple of years maybe, or something like that. So when I think about the challenge that arose for me, I developed insomnia. Like I said, I was not a kind person to my soon-to-be husband, and then just fried being a therapist who wasn't sleeping, worried about my sister, who was engaged in a behavior pattern that is life or death. Anorexia is no joke. If you look up the life expectancy of somebody who develops anorexia and doesn't get out of it, it's a literal life or death issue. So it's important to, and I knew that was pretty heavy. So when we think about many of you who have adult siblings who are highly sensitive, who don't have the skill sets of managing their emotions, because potentially you were parented in a traditional parenting household, or where one parent was traditionally parented, or your parents didn't have a way to teach without traditionally parenting, and didn't want to, so then fell into a pattern of passivity, and just waiting and seeing if your highly sensitive sibling would learn the skills they needed to learn. All of those patterns are indicative of learning as an adult that other people need to be taken care of instead of you, or in spite of your needs. So that's lesson number 2. I learned to make sure that everybody was okay before I figured out if I was okay. So when we think about the next pattern, when we think of, and where we see highly sensitive children and highly sensitive siblings, this might be something that you see often in your household if you're parenting more than one kid, where your non-highly sensitive child isn't telling you what's really going on because they don't have enough space to do that. So parenting a highly sensitive child takes up a lot of emotional energy. Spoke about that on part 1, right? So I learned that I needed to avoid problems because they get worse when you call them out. When we pay attention to them. So for example, when my parents would set limits effectively for my sister, she would struggle so much there would be meltdowns and yelling and saying things that she didn't mean, but she felt trapped in the moment and couldn't handle it. And then it became worse because then she would receive a punishment for that, and that would escalate the situation. And that was scary. Hearing yelling and screaming is traumatic over and over again. And then also comforting my sister and taking care of her by feeling like she really needed to learn the lesson right now. Otherwise, it was going to keep going was a hard lesson for me to have to learn as a young adult. As a preteen and teenager, because I had to help her feel better based on mistakes she was making, decisions she was making. And half the time I ended up lecturing her too. So that created a significant rift in our relationship. And so it was very anxiety producing for me to deal with it. And so sometimes I would get mad at her, and then other times I would just like disconnect from that. So I learned to emotionally disconnect, which is this avoidance we're talking about. A lot of highly sensitive kids learn to avoid their emotions, and siblings of highly sensitive kids learn to avoid their emotions too, because they're so big that mom and dad can't help with them. And then you learn the same lesson by watching, because there's a model going on in the household. So I learned that lesson. I learned that when I really speak about them, again, speaking to my ineffective skills of speaking about them when I was mad, and so yelling and screaming and not doing that effectively too, it made it worse. And then I didn't know how to be calm, didn't know how to calm down. I was just told to calm down. So there's a big difference between knowing how and like knowing what to do. So I learned to just avoid it, stuff it, deal with it later, or and this is bringing me to the next one, which is just work hard and get my needs met in a different way. So receiving accolades or acknowledgement, or that I was making my parents proud, didn't come from my ability to express my needs effectively. It came from performance. So, I wouldn't be able to run a successful business, let alone two, if I still had that problem. I would be fried. I would be working day in, day out every day. I would be rude to my husband and my kid. I would be an awful boss to work for because I would just blame my team members or my employees for not doing it my way. That is absolutely how I would lead if I didn't build the skills that I had to do a lot of work in adulthood. And one of the things that one of my favorite clients says is we want to do the work now so that our kid doesn't have to do the hard work later. And that perspective is really important, that you start to acclimate as a parent of a highly sensitive child, because it was work deciding to be a different person, deciding to respond to the world in a way that doesn't mean that everybody's out to get out against me, and then I have to like climb mountains to feel okay and to feel like I'm accomplishing something. So I learned to work hard to get my needs met, and that that also played out in my relationships. So I saw that play out in my first relationship, first adult intimate relationship, dating a child of an alcoholic. He literally could not feel negative emotions because it was not safe in his household. And so I dated somebody who was emotionally unable to experience negative emotion with me. So whenever I got frustrated or upset with how we were relating to each other in a relationship, there were a lot of patterns of just being, what's the word, like rejected, or he just couldn't handle it. So that obviously is quite tumultuous, and was an unhealthy choice of mine to choose somebody who had those behavior patterns. And so I learned that I had to work really, really hard to feel like I could be loved or lovable in my adult relationships. And that's a lesson that I needed to do a lot of personal work on through coaching, primarily because therapy just wasn't effective for me. It just felt like a bunch of vent sessions. So when I experienced the need to teach to parents of highly sensitive kids and how to break out of this pattern, the focus for many of you is on breaking out of the emotional meltdown cycle. And when you see that your child's behavior is communicating an unmet need, it's really important that you're not using traditional parenting strategies to teach them that their needs are invalid or inappropriate. Now, their behavior might be inappropriate, and that requires strategy to teach them how to respond and share how to communicate their needs in a safe and effective way. But the fact that they need help, the fact that they need a creative solution to their problem, the fact that they feel frustrated shouldn't be a flaw for them, shouldn't be a bad thing. So when you are trying to parent your highly sensitive child, and you're trying to parent them in a way that also acknowledges your sensitive or non-sensitive siblings, your other children, and their siblings, it's important to understand that while you're prioritizing this meltdown cycle and not breaking out of it, your other children are watching, and they're struggling, even if they don't think that they are. Or even if you don't think that they are, because they're learning from you that big emotions are scary and big emotions are hard to manage. So when we think about what it takes, the great news is that you're able to break this cycle in less than 8 weeks. We see many, many parents that we work with be able to turn this pattern around for their non-highly sensitive kids quite swiftly. And for their sensitive kids, 8 weeks is 2 months. That is something that you can absolutely do with the right accountability, support, and strategy. And so you know that our strategy here at MTC is to focus on first you as a parent, break down those barriers where you feel like traditional parenting is the only way to go. Obviously, supporting you in communicating playfully without shame, and then strategically addressing your child's specific behavior problems in a way that is personalized and requires a lot of hands-on support. And you need to be able to do that consistently. And so we teach you how to do that. And so if that's the plan that you need support with, and you've been trying to do this on your own by systematically trying to solve the problem, and haven't gotten there yet, then I encourage you to go ahead and book a call, because it's free. There's that. But there's also the opportunity in terms of parenting a sensitive child or a sensitive teen to notice that the whole family benefits from this support. This isn't just, deciding that your sensitive kid is the only one who has big behaviors and therefore is the only one who has big needs. Everybody in the family is impacted by this big problem. And as I mentioned before, it takes a lot of work to break out of this pattern, because growing up feeling like your parents are too strapped to really meet your needs creates a sense of feeling undervalued and unvalued. And that's traumatic for children, because when we think about the challenge that sensitive kids have, so do non-highly sensitive kids. They all need to feel worthy, valued, cared for, capable, and focused on being able to be creatively in being able to creatively solve their problems. And you need to set the tone and the environment for that. And so, again, my personal experience and focusing on why this is so crucial to our mission here at MTC. It's not just because I understand the science, but because I know what happens when you struggle to create this for your family, and how it impacts the whole household. And then lastly, it's very important that I bust the myths that the people are going to be okay when they grow up if these parenting strategies are used, because they're not. Poor relationship building patterns are innately taught through traditional parenting strategies, and it's not simply something that you can decide to think about differently. You need to act differently and systematically shift out of that. It requires true transformation, which requires mindset support and strategy, which is why what we do can be so transformative for families who are a good fit. Again, go to meganthompsoncoaching.com/talk and meganthompsoncoaching.com/teen talk if you or your teen needs support in changing this dynamic. And for parents of sensitive kids, you are the ones who need to be supporting your sensitive child out of this cycle, because sensitive kids benefit best in terms of behavior change from changing how they're receiving their parenting relationship. And that requires you to take a different approach. And that approach needs to be quite systematic. So again, meganthompsoncoaching.com/talk. I don't know if I can help you until we speak, until you and I or a member of my team speak about where you're struggling, what your goals are, and whether or not you'd be a fit for our work together. So that's why we do the call. I will speak to you soon, and